Hello, and welcome to the Fiction Nonfiction Podcast from Literary Hub, where we believe that every issue in your social media feed or on the evening news has already been tackled somewhere in literature. I'm Vivi Ganeshananthan, also known as Sugi, author of the novel Brotherless Night.
And I'm Jennifer Maritza McCauley, author of Neon Steel.
So, Jennifer, do you like horror novels?
They terrify me. So like is an interesting word because I do like the genre and the idea of the genre, but personally freaks me out. Freaks me out. I put it into a drawer because it freaked me out so much. How about you?
I mean, I didn't think I liked horror, but then when I was a teenager, my parents forbade me to read Stephen King, but my brother had Stephen King.
Oh, okay. So there is no way the next part of the story is about you listening to
It's true. My parents said don't do it, and I definitely immediately went and did it. So for months, every time I was home alone, I would like scooch over to his room and grab one of them and read like even just a few pages. I was like Charlie Bucket eating the chocolate bar very slowly, you know? But in the end, I did get through both books, and well, wow.
that. Yeah, sounds like a secret endeavor and sounds like you're a fan.
Well, I mean, Stephen King was just doing so many things I had no idea you could do until I saw them in his pages. He's just had such an extraordinary and varied career. He is, for me, and I think so many other people, just the horror writer. And
Mm.
today we get to discuss his work with Caroline Bicks, the inaugural Stephen E. King Chair in Literature at the University of Maine, King's home state. Caroline is an internationally recognized Shakespeare scholar who has published widely on early modern drama, gender, and the history of science. She studied Renaissance poetry at Harvard as an undergrad and received her PhD in English from Stanford. After she became the King Chair in 2017, Stephen King granted her access to his personal papers, which led to her new book, Monsters in the Archives: My Year of Fear with Stephen King. Caroline, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited.
Yeah, it's so great to have you. So Monsters in the Archives is about your experience revisiting five King books you read when you were young via your
Mhm.
special access to King's archives. So the first book you read as a kid was Night Shift, a
Mhm.
1978 collection of stories that contains classics like Children of the Corn, The
Mhm.
Boogeyman, and Night Surf, which was so prophetic. Can you tell us can you tell us about the initial memorable encounter with Night Shift and the
Yeah.
Boogeyman?
Yeah. I mean, what's so fun about getting to talk to people about this book, all over the world. Almost across the board, everyone's first experience with Stephen King is when they're like 12, 13, 14. Not always, but it seems to be this sweet spot age. And so it seems to be like whatever book he had just published, that's the one that people read, like when they were 12, 13, 14. For me, since I'm a kid of the 70s, I was really lucky that, I didn't have like 40 books to catch up on. There were only like five. So I was 12 when I saw Night Shift on the shelf of my public
Mhm.
library. Took it. I had never read Stephen King before. I'd never read horror, really, unless you
Right.
count like Witch of Blackbird Pond or something. You know, um,
I really
I,
like that book.
I love that book too. It's a different kind of horror. But this was
Sure.
my first encounter with like straight up, oh my God, horror,
Mhm.
and it was that sixth story in the collection, which is The Boogeyman, that
Mhm.
just shook me to the core, and has never left me. So that was my first encounter. And then because I was 12 and wasn't thinking about maybe this isn't so good for me, I couldn't stop reading. Right? So that's when I
Right.
devoured, you know, The Stand. And I remember one of you, I think, said that you had a brother who had The Stand and it.
That was me.
And I was like, I think for a lot of us too, if you had older siblings, I'm assuming this was an older sibling,
Yes.
like we got exposed to these books before we probably should have been. So that's how it
Yeah,
came
for
across.
sure.
The Shining was on my older sibling's shelf. And then Salem's Lot, Carrie. I actually was in my school library, Carrie. So anyway, that's a long answer to your question, but I get so excited thinking about first encounters with these books.
Yeah,
You
absolutely.
tell a really startling story about being in an accident as a kid and ending up with scars on your hand, and then the image of Night Shift
Yeah, I mean that's another
echoing
like
that.
yeah, I mean, and that's another funny thing, like talking to people around anyone who was growing up in the 70s has like the same scar on their hand because they didn't have the kind of glass that is safety proof. So it's like we've all put our hands through these glass doors. So anyway, it was a very deep scar. And when I saw that image on the cover of Night Shift, which I don't know if you remember, is like a hand with eyes on it and then the gauze. It was like looking at my own hand. So there were many kinds of memories that were surfacing during that. But really what drove me to writing this book was thinking about why did a story like The Boogeyman, and not the visuals of the hand, I mean, that's funny and interesting, but really what got stuck in my head was the language. Why did I still remember words and phrases from The Boogeyman? And why had that story gotten me so freaked out? So part of the journey for me writing this book was also just discovering all the different layers to how he crafted his stories and why they're able, at the level of the language, to get in there, to get in your head and stick.
So for our listeners who might not know the story, The Boogeyman, could
Oh
you
God.
gloss it a little bit and think,
Okay.
well, it's
I
also a
will.
particularly interesting story. You talk about, I mean, I think one of the things I really love about this book is that you reflect on your experience as a childhood reader and then you return to the same books. And I mean, Jennifer, I'm sure you've had, when you return to a book that you loved, like now I
Oh,
want to
yeah.
reread The Witch of
Oh,
Blackbird Pond. And
absolutely.
Right?
I'm
I know.
sure,
That's been on
Absolutely.
my TBR list for a while, yeah. To be
and it would be
reread.
like a totally different experience. And you're a Shakespeare scholar,
Yeah.
and you read The Boogeyman when you were 12, and then you returned to it with all of the king's secret papers.
Yeah. Yeah. I
What was
mean,
that? What was that like?
so just for a quick gloss, it is a horrible story. So you might want to plug your ears if you don't want to hear a story that's going to stick with you forever. I promise you. It's about Lester Billings, who's a man who's telling his psychiatrist about how over the last 5 years, all three of his children have been killed in their cribs by this boogeyman, this creature in their closet. And he's sort of confessing this to the psychiatrist. And they're all very young, like they're two, almost two. The third one is like a little bit older, but so it's a horrifying story because it just takes you through each of the child's reaching and screaming out, not yet being verbal. That's what I realized is so scary about that story. They couldn't quite explain what was happening to them, and they were stuck in these cribs. So all they could do is say like night light, like they wanted a light or like boogeyman, but I'm getting chills even describing it. So, and at the end of the story, Lester Billings goes to make more appointments with a psychiatrist. He's like, yeah, you need more appointments. And he comes back into the office and sees that the psychiatrist's closet door is open ajar, and he realizes that the monster is the psychiatrist, which is actually to me not the scariest part of the story. The scariest part is that home is not a safe place. The mother, Rita Billings, can't protect her children from her pretty horrible husband, who's just pretty negligent with the kids with the boogeyman. And so returning to the story again in the context of everything I was starting to understand about what King was exploring at that point in his life and his career, all of those books that I write about, he wrote literally within 6 years. I mean, it was incredibly prolific time. And just thinking about what it was like for him being first a teenager when he's writing some of these stories that end up in Night Shift, and then revising them, like selling them to men's magazines when he just graduates and he's got two small children of his own very quickly, and needs to support them by selling stories to men's magazines. So he and Tabitha, both scraping by, and then revising them one more time to put them into Night Shift in 1978. So it's a fascinating to me. I know we don't have to just keep talking about Night Shift, but to me, it really is kind of the core center of the book. My book is that just sort of thinking about who he was during this time of incredible change, rapid change, losing your ideals, losing your mother. I mean, his mother died just months before Carrie was published, which his first published novel. So a story like The Boogeyman was profound for me to think back to what scared me at first, and doing the work for this book of realizing, of course, it's mothers. It's mothers aren't there. Mothers can't keep you safe, right? For me, that was the core terror. But then getting to talk to him and ask him directly. I mean, that part, it was just incredible to be able to, first of all, see how he crafted early drafts, but then get to talk to him, And the man has an incredible memory. So even, he wrote that story 50 years ago. more. But he could still say something about being scared about his kids dying of crib death. And I thought, oh my God, right? He's coming at it as an adult parent. I was coming at it as a 12-year-old, but we're all the same story is speaking to us. It's just hitting us at different points in our timeline, right?
Mm.
I think that's why these stories endure because he has this way of getting just getting at these human fears about loss, whether it's loss of your child or loss of your mother. Um,
That's fascinating. I think
yeah.
Yeah.
just listening to you talk, like, I mean, he is someone who revises and expands himself. And, I think we think of writers like Whitman or Alcott or Louise, like Ella Montgomery was notorious for this actually. But like, I don't know that there's been such I don't know. I really appreciated the study of how good he is at returning to and altering his own characters
Yeah.
and plots. And another example of
Mm.
that is in Night Surf. And as you know, I was very interested in The Stand, which hit me at just the right moment
Yeah.
because it
Yeah.
was forbidden. I was
Right.
not supposed to read it, which of course guaranteed that I snuck into my brother's room every time I was left home alone.
I think a
And
lot
I
of us
would,
have that memory about
Oh
the
yeah.
stand is that it felt like very grown up to read it. Like there was something about it that felt more grown up even than The Shining or something like that. It's just, I don't know if it's
I
because of
mean,
apocalyptic, it just was taking on these themes that were just,
it
yeah.
was terrible. I mean, it was the scariest book I had read, and I couldn't stop reading it. And I would like, no one would be home, and I would tiptoe into his room, and I'm like, who's going to
Oh
hear
my
me?
God.
But still,
I just can't believe you did that with
Yeah.
it. I mean, it to me is also one that's like, oh
Oh
my God,
no.
don't go in there by yourself and read it with.
no, I mean, it was. But so in Night Shift, there is a story called Night Surf,
Hmm.
and that was kind of the seed of The Stand, and I was fascinated by how you read that story, and you
Yeah.
in writing about it, you mentioned COVID and also other pandemic slash public health incidents.
Yeah.
And then you corresponded with Stephen King about it,
Yeah.
and you got some insight
It,
into what he was like as a young person, which I found.
yeah. So what for the whole Night Shift chapter, I mean, I went into it, I started by reading all of the columns he wrote when he was an undergraduate at UMaine, in the UMaine campus newspaper. And he had this column called King's Garbage Truck. And it was like, it's an incredible treasure trove because it's got all of the things that he's thinking about, like what albums he's listening to, what books he likes to read, but also like descriptions of him in a anti-war protest, getting hit in the stomach by a fellow student and just that. So it just opened up a lot of avenues for me when I got to a story like The Children of the Corn, for example, which I had no idea. I was like, am I really going to see anything if I go back to this story? I don't know. Luckily, there was an early draft of it in the archives that he never published because most of the Night Shift stories actually were published elsewhere, and didn't change a lot, with just tiny things. But wow, that Children of the Corn has a very different version that's in the archives that to me really spoke to his his angst about like what because he wrote it pretty close to his time as discovering his politics and being a student and experiencing that disillusionment about like my fellow peers are going to beat me up or like who are they like
Mm.
um and and then the Kent State shootings happen right while he's an undergrad, so he's thinking about like what if you join the National Guard and you have to end up shooting one of your fellow peer, it's just so when I got to The Children of the Corn, which is just called The Children, the version that is in the archives, what was really interesting is Bert is definitely like, there's a lot more backstory to Bert. He's much more violent against the kids, and he actually kind of is psyched about it. And he's kind of grappling with the fact that he used to be an anti-war activist, that he used to be a
Mm.
pacifist. And none of this makes it to the final version of the story that people know. So it's really, it's like he's grappling with like, what kind of person am I going to be? Like, to me, it's a story about loss of ideals, but it's also about like a grown up being violent toward kids and harming them, right? And then those kids having to now sacrifice themselves at age 18 instead of 19, and it's just to me such a powerful story about the draft, but also about like what is it like to realize that the grown-ups might pass on really crappy stuff to you and might not actually be there to protect you. So that's just a micro example. I mean, there were much bigger things, bigger changes that I found, but I loved the micro things. I mean, those were to me like as a literature person, I know you can relate to this. It's like that's the that's the fun, right? When you find those little jewels. Yeah.
So one of the things that you talked about the micro, I know you talked about micro crafting, which I thought was really interesting.
Mhm.
Um, and you also talked about the sonic and oral qualities of Stephen's work and quote unquote, how much attention he pays to the sound effects of his word choices. I
Yeah.
love that. So I was wondering what makes Stephen King's writing King-esque to you? What makes it, has that special spice?
Wow, that's a great question. I mean, I don't know if I would say like, oh, his is so much more special than another. I think what's just really fascinating, and I think because I'm coming at this from my Shakespeare kind of eye, because Shakespeare is my first kind of love language, I could
Right.
see the ways that he is doing the same kind of work mobilizing word sounds to tap into human emotions and to
Mm,
capture experiences. So that something like tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow creeps in this petty pace from day to day, that famous Macbeth speech. But that he has that same, King has that same ability, that gift, that ear, for taking a concept, right? And again, mobilizing the word sounds so that they get embedded. You're feeling them all the way through you, right? This is how I feel about Shakespeare. Like a particular Shakespeare line will not just get in my head, I'll feel it in my body, and I feel like that he and Shakespeare are masters of the same kind of ability. So they're not, what's the secret sauce, I suppose, is just understanding the power of word sounds.
yeah.
And I've been thinking a lot about this, like how Shakespeare was writing for the stage. And so this, of course, his words are meant to be heard, but also that horror stories are connected to an oral tradition.
Mm,
And I feel like King appreciates that. Like that, I feel like there's more to be done with that, sort of thinking about the power of an oral narrative, um, and how you have to do different things with word sounds, to make an
yeah.
oral narrative stick.
He's also a writer who's so attuned to music and who is
Yes.
always referencing
Yes.
music and who is himself a musician. And there is a little snippet in this book where he's talking to Amy Tan, who I think he's in a band with.
Yeah,
And
that's how they met.
right,
And yeah, it's in the foreword of On Writing.
right. And they're sort of complaining to each other about how like, they love doing events, but no one asks them about the language.
What?
And I was
How
like,
come no one ever
oh,
asks about the language? And that really was kind of the inspiring, like when I went back, I was like, right, I'm going to write a book that's about asking about the language. Like that was sort of that's about all I had, when I went into the archives. I didn't have like a grand plan. I knew the 5 books I was going to focus on because those had been the 5 that had scared me the most when I was a kid. And I really wanted to write something different than an academic book. I wanted this to be accessible. I wanted it to be reaching all kinds of people. And I wanted to be able to bring my whole self to it, not just my Shakespeare professor brain. I really wanted to be able to talk about fear, re-experience reading these stories again and write about it in real time. Like, how did it feel? How did it feel to have to revisit the woman in room 217 like 10 times because he has so many drafts, and having to read her
Hmm.
again and again and again. And I wanted to write about how it actually felt, not just how cool it was for my brain and things I was discovering, but also how it felt because I think again, great stories stick with us because they hit us in all the places, right?
I also love those little tidbits where you're talking about being a professor and the anxiety of bringing him in and kind of dealing with all of the kind of like
Yeah.
it was vulnerable in a way that I found very satisfying and very
Oh,
accessible. So thanks for that too.
well, I'm glad. Yeah, it was scary because I didn't
Yeah,
meet him. I didn't meet him for 4 years into this job, and I was like,
right.
I didn't know what he would be like, but
Yeah.
he was lovely. Yeah.
So the book is filled with specific close reads like which are incredibly useful from a craft point of view, since we're talking a little bit about craft.
Mhm.
So I wanted to ask you about some changes King made to the title character in his famous novel, Carrie. As you describe in your book, Carrie changes quite a bit from King's early drafts to the final version, including the fact that she originally began to grow horns. Can you trace the evolution of that character?
I mean, yeah, she's probably was the most shocking
Mm,
change that I ran, although the ending of The Shining was that was probably the most shocking, that original ending I found. But I would say character-wise, yeah, Carrie was the one that went through the biggest transformation. And that's a fascinating one because when I think if you're a King person, there's so much lore around Carrie because it's the first novel he
Mm,
published and it's the one that made his career and like allowed them to move out of their trailer in Herman and finally get a phone with a connection and all of these things. Like it was so transformational.
right.
But the whole story about how it almost never got written because he wrote 3 pages, put it in the garbage, and was like, I don't know anything about girls, And then Tabitha, his wife, pulled it out of the trash and said, I think you have something here. So, from the beginning, it's a story that has this so much lore around it, right? About him and like this important moment in his development as a writer. But that first draft that she pulled out of the trash, and then the next one, so we don't have that one, that's lost. But the next one that he wrote is very similar, has all the same hallmarks to that first one. And it is like she is completely unsympathetic. Like she is like something out of a comic book. She grows
Mm,
this giant, by the end, she's just a giant brain sack
mm,
literally, and her head explodes. And as Sue is running, I don't know if you remember that final scene, like Sue, who's been, the good one, who's been trying to help her by letting Tommy take her to the prom instead of her. It's her boyfriend, and then she's the one who finds Carrie dying at the end. And in the original version, it's like Sue just starts running away screaming because the head explodes. I mean, it's like there's nothing about like her having to mind meld with Carrie. That's kind of the
yeah.
end sequence that's so powerful is like you get so drawn into Carrie's all the good and the bad and all of the horrible experiences she has to go through and the emotions. And what really struck me is that as he's crafting her and revising her, he's really thinking about like how to make her someone that really is like a lightning rod for all human emotions and that each of the characters as he's redrafting starts to connect with her brain, right, and or her emotions. And so in that final, what ends up getting published, Sue is running away in fear, but only because she was forced to experience death with Carrie.
Mm,
She had to feel it because Carrie grabs onto her mind and takes her with her.
mm,
And so the evolution for me as I was tracking it and thinking about it, and I love this because I had just written a whole book about cognition and girlhood in Shakespeare's time. And I was really fascinated by this topic about like, we're not giving girls their due. Like, they really actually are, people believe, and not just, you go back 400 years, like, they understood that something special happened to girls' brains when they hit puberty.
mm,
And King mentions that he calls it mental puberty when Carrie gets her period and starts having telekinetic powers. But he's not just pathologizing her. I mean, he did in the first draft. I think he was just thinking, this will sell. This is sensational. But as he was redrafting her, you can see she's very sympathetic. And what comes
mm,
alive in her brain is not just her telekinetic powers, but also her ability to remember, which really struck a chord with me. Like, I don't know if you remember this from the book, but she ends up remembering all the trauma that she experienced when she was 3, when her mother tried to kill
mm,
her, and she hadn't remembered it until then. So to me, that really spoke to what I see happening to girls' brains. Certainly during Shakespeare's day and his characters and in the medical literature, it's like their brains light up, like their
mm.
memories, their imaginations, their intellectual abilities, and yes, maybe telekinetic powers. But so I guess if that gets at your question about what I saw happening, and that was a really cool conversation to have with him because that's a book he doesn't like. He actually is like, I don't,
Yeah.
I don't reread that
Yes,
book.
I
I
remember
think
that.
it's the work of a young man who thought he was better than he was. That's
Yeah.
what he says.
Yeah.
But as we were talking, I was like, I think you should reread it because I think like the ending to me was especially powerful and really to me very Macbethian actually about like death and like what you see when you die. Um, so that was a pretty special conversation about like how and why he changed her. He said, I wanted to make her an all-American girl, he said.
I love that part of the book too.
Yeah.
And one of the things that you had said too is that you said that Carrie wasn't one of his favorite books, but he also said it's important to him. And I thought that was so interesting that you put that in there too.
Yeah. Yeah.
There's an importance to it. It's like he understands, like you said, it was something that was written by, I think what was the quote? You said it was written by a young man who thought he knew more than he did.
Hmm.
And I thought that was just fascinating, but also that, it's still important to him, even though he may have been in this different point of his life. It just,
Yeah.
that was really interesting for
Yeah.
sure.
He had so many just gems that he would just drop. Sometimes he would just whip out an email response to me and and it would be gorgeous. I would ask him a question, and then he would, within an hour, he'd have this really, really thoughtful response. It's kind of astonishing that he could just do that so quickly and be so connected to those stories still and be thinking about them.
Yeah.
It's a real treat to see the different stages of his work. I'm reminded of my friend Peter Hodavies wrote a book called The Art of Revision, and in it he talks about how like so much of revision is just invisible to us because we
Yeah.
see, of course, we see the final drafts. And so
Right.
this kind of sneak peek into his choices. And as I
Yeah.
think about Carrie, I don't know about you, Jennifer. I'm actually too chicken to have ever seen Carrie, but
Oh,
that is such an iconic image, right, of Sissy Spacek, like
Yeah.
drenched.
drenched in blood. And
Yeah.
yeah, and he does like that movie. I mean, he doesn't like Kubrick's Shining, but he really likes De Palma's Carrie.
I
Yeah.
mean, it's incredible, and then it also got remade.
Yeah, it got remade.
Mhm.
Not great timing. I think it was right after Sandy Hook, and so that it got a lot of blowback. Actually, people were like, "Wait, this is not a time to do a movie about a mass, murder in a high school."
Right.
Yeah.
But it's like there's something about his work that is like the violence is so crucial to the stories, and it's also so cinematic. And so one of the interesting things in the book, you put in these notes, these images from his drafts, things from his correspondence between him and his conversations with him and his editor, him rethinking things himself. And sometimes it's about the violence. And as someone who sometimes writes quite violent material, I was so interested in this because sometimes it would be like
Too
too much,
much.
Stephen, rein it in.
And he
And
would write that like in the Salem's Lot section where it's like baby Randy is getting staked and then the body explodes and it's just and that didn't make it to the final draft, thank God. But in the margin note, he's written, a little too much, but how to change or how to fix. I'm like, you just take it out, which you did.
right. And so there's this interesting like evolution of restraint, which I don't
Yes.
know is how most
Yeah.
people I mean, it's really not how I think of him as a writer, right? He's so full blown, he's so full throttle. And then I'm like, oh my
Yeah.
God, the earlier drafts were even fuller throttled
Oh,
than I
yeah.
didn't know was possible.
Yeah, he's being very thoughtful, very thoughtful. And then in some cases, like Pet Cemetery, the scene when he's digging up Gage, I don't know
That
if
is
people
just what I was
know
going to ask you
that.
about.
Yeah, so that's if in case people want a quick synopsis, even though again I feel awful
Please.
like putting these stories out there, but yeah, and this one's based on a memory, something that actually almost happened to his youngest son Owen when they were renting a house on Route 15, the same route that I drive to work. Um, and he almost gets hit by a truck. But in the novel, the 2-year-old does get hit by a truck. It's horrible and dies, obviously. And their house is right behind it is something called a pet cemetery, and beyond that is an ancient Mi'kmaq burial ground that is sour earth. And if you bury anything there, it comes back, but in a very monstrous form. So that, and that's the last of the books that I talk about. It's the first one I started with. I'm really glad I did because it had so many incredible things in it. But he wrote it in 1978. It doesn't get published till 1983. He put it in a drawer because it was so horrible. And in the story, little Gage does come back and he is monstrous and he murders, his mother and a neighbor, and it's just awful. And then, ugh. But that scene when he's unearthing his son, because first his son is buried in a regular cemetery, and then Lewis, who's the father, decides it's going to be worth it to have his son come back to life, even if it's not exactly how he used to be, right? So the scene that was really this was pretty profound for me. That was the first time I discovered something that he really had changed at the level of, there was an amazing margin note that I found that he wrote to himself. Because as he's digging up his son, right, it's horrible. In the first draft, it's pretty easy. Like it was easy. It has things like the digging was easy and the dirt just flew, and then he opens up the ground, and then it's horrible. He sees his son, but it's relatively quick, and there aren't things getting in the way, so he doesn't have any time to think about what he's doing. What he ends up publishing, so if you know the novel, is something much more complicated. Like there's a grave liner, there's a cement grave liner that he has to figure out how he's going to first pry up, and he brings with him all this extra rope and everything. So in the margin of that first draft he's written, I think I tried to tag it so I could read it because I didn't want to get it wrong. He adds this in the margin note. He says, if you added a concrete cap, he can lever it up, perhaps. The cement would not be set, or the hot patch stuff. In actuality, there probably would be a cap. So you can see him thinking about this, like putting the
Mm.
grave liner in there, the concrete. And then in the next draft, Lewis has to bring all this extra equipment. He has to figure out how to pulley it up. And there's just much more sensory moments of like pebbles going down into the hole, and like he's trying to balance himself and not get his toe crushed by the cement liner. And the point is, it's like, yes, it adds a lot of more opportunity for just these horrible oral details of like the gritting sound of the pivoting of the rope on the pulley that he's had to jigger up here, but also the sound of those pebbles, and also just it's hard work. Like he has to think about what he's doing, and there's more time for him to question, like, what the hell am I doing? Should I be doing this? Right? Which is, of course, kind of the heart of this whole book. And when I found that change he made to dead is better, like it was death is better originally, and he changes it to sometimes dead is better. And for him, that's really the heart of the book. It's like, should you do this or shouldn't you? Like, because sometimes it's better
Mm.
to just be dead. But none of that, it's just by amping up not just the suspense, but the full sensory experience of what it means to actually exhume this little kid, this person he loves so much, is at the core of that story. That's what makes it so horrible, right? Of course, and those were other changes I saw him making to Pet Cemetery. Like when Gage comes back in the first draft, he's just a monster. He's just evil. There are all these references to him being just evil. He's like, it's an ancient evil. By the time he recrafts Gage, it's like he's kind of still a little kid. You can still see glimpses of
Mm.
his little kidness that is just heartbreaking. Yeah, I've really brought down the room now. I've brought
no,
down the
it's
room.
Yeah, I
fine. No,
know. I'm
I
it's
just
shouldn't
like,
have
I'm just
mentioned it.
no.
that's wonderful. It was
Yeah.
wonderful.
My yeah, I mean, this is so interesting to hear you talk about. Jennifer, how are you with horror films? We were talking about horror books at the top
Oh,
of the show,
okay.
but
So when I first had to read it, I read it, I was terrified, and then I put it in my drawer, and because I was afraid like it was going to come from the book. I
Oh
don't know how
yeah.
to explain it, but I was like, I read it, I was like, oh, no, it's alive. So I just put the
Yeah.
book in a drawer, and I left it in my office at work, and I was just like, I don't want this in my house because I don't want Pennywise to come for me.
Oh my God. So you read it as an adult with a
I read
job?
it as an adult because I didn't read a lot of horror. So I read it when I was in graduate school. And I was writing a paper about Toni Morrison's Beloved
Mm.
and It, and trying to
Oh
kind of
my
compare
God.
both of them. And I have to say that it was just terrifying to me because I just did not read a lot of horror. I mean, like the classic horror, but not like, contemporary horror. So I was just overwhelmed by how terrified I was.
So that experience, this is another thing, like one of the things I'm hoping this book will remind people of is why books matter so much and why actually
Yes.
material books matter. I mean, it's
Yeah.
fine if you want to listen to an Audible and, ebook and all that, but like when I teach, unless a student needs to have a computer screen, they're no, like everyone has a hard copy of the book. Like we're all sitting around with the hard copy of the book, partially
Yeah.
because back to that idea of like embodied experience, right? Like you now
Right.
have an experience of it that involves being scared of the actual material object,
Oh,
right?
yeah.
I had the
Yeah.
same experience with Pet Cemetery,
Yeah.
like the cover. I'm scared of it. Like I turn it over. Like I don't want to look at it.
yeah, after
Um,
I would yeah, like after I would sneak out of my brother's room, I would have very carefully replaced the books in exactly the same order in exactly the same place. He 100% knew I was doing this, by the way. Um, but like to your point about books, right? Like I will never watch, like I know Welcome to Derry is now a show, and then right, like I will never watch it. I will never watch I can read horror, but if I watch a horror film,
yeah.
then I truly can't escape.
So I've
But
thought a
Oh,
lot
wow.
about this. I've thought a lot about this. Obviously, working on this project, I've gone into a lot of places thinking about why a book, why the experience of reading a horror book actually, I think, sticks with you longer, but is a different kind of feeling than being terrified by a film. Like, I can't watch horror movies actually because I
Mhm.
think for me, it's about control, and this is part of what I
Mm.
write about in the introduction when I'm talking about my first introductions to horror would actually be Wizard of Oz, like reading the Wizard of Oz with my
Mm.
mother, which was a really cathartic experience because I was a very scared kid. I never wanted to be away from my mom. I never wanted to go anywhere that wasn't home. So for me, reading the Wizard of Oz, which is a really scary book, allowed me to approach fear at my own pace, right? And to sort of go, I could decide to close the book if I wanted to. Like, I think there's something empowering that allows the reading of a book to be more cathartic, to approach your personal fears or traumas, but to do it from a place of a little more control, right? Because the reading process, you have to agree, right? He writes about this so beautifully in On Writing about books being a uniquely portable magic because it's this place where you and
Mm.
the writer's imagination are coming together and you're having a meeting of the minds, right? When it's a film, I feel like you're helpless. Like
Right.
you can't control, you don't know, you can't just I guess you could run out of the movie theater, but it's such a different kind of experience.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think the last time I ran out of a movie theater was during The Passion of the Christ.
Oh.
True
That
story.
could also be a horror film in a
I mean,
manner.
it kind of was at the point that I
Yeah.
was watching it. But yeah, I
Yeah.
mean, I take your point, like in a movie theater, or even, I mean, I guess in my own living room, I have some mild control, but I'm essentially, I'm the baby in the crib being like, light, boogeyman.
Oh no, you went there. Oh
I'm
no.
sorry.
No, yeah, but I'm like, no. I also get a pit in my stomach. Yeah.
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 Anyway, like I think this is so like the vocabulary of all of this is made for so many of us out of King. And we
Mm.
port this experience into all of the other horror we read and see.
Mm-hmm.
So, Jennifer, I wonder if in the interest of time, we really should have Caroline read. And I think we've
Oh
covered most of the
yeah.
other things. So
Yeah.
maybe if you want to,
Yeah.
maybe I can quickly ask the question about Maine and then Caroline, maybe you could read, Jennifer can ask you to read and then we can
Yeah.
finish there. What do you think?
Yeah, it sounds perfect. If
Okay.
that's okay with
Um,
Caroline.
Yeah.
okay. Three, two, one. So I just want to rewind a bit. You were talking about Route 15, and as a kid, you spent some time in Maine, and of course, now you live in Maine, and this
Mm-hmm.
work reminds you of Maine, and King is from Maine. And in your chapter about Salem's Lot, you argue that that book comes specifically from King's love of his home state. And would
His
you talk
hometown.
about
Yeah.
yeah, would you talk a little bit about King and Maine and that book?
Yeah, I mean, that was my favorite conversation I had with him was talking about him telling me, because I think everyone just assumes King was born in Maine and stayed in Maine, was always in Maine. But for 9 years there, between ages 2 and 11, he wasn't in Maine because his father left the family when he was 2. He never saw him again. And the family, his mother and his brother and him, they moved all over the country. And it wasn't until he was 11 that he really moved to Maine and moved to Durham, Maine, which is a pretty rural community. And as we were talking about it, he was telling me that he hated it at first because he was like, I want malls. I want paved roads. Like they had just been living in Stratford, Connecticut, you know. So he hasn't always been like, yay, Maine, but he also describes like how he fell in love with that town. So when he was 11, right, such a formative age, and think about it, right? How old are all those kids? 11, right? How old is Mark Petrie in Salem's Lot? 12. Like there's something very magical about that particular community of Durham, and Salem's Lot, the town, is based on Durham. Like I mean, he's very open about that, and he's written about that. And so when I went and visited the town, I was like, oh my God, right, I get it. Like this is scary, but but for him, he fell in love with it because it was where he discovered, his best friend. He had a great teacher. He fell in love with reading other kinds of books. Like he found H.P. Lovecraft books that his father had left in a trunk because it was like where his father had grown up. So it's like a mix of happy memories and also some really hard memories, right? And when you read Salem's Lot, you're like, oh my God, of course, this is a book about how this town is a place that you can love and hate at the same time. Like it's a place that has trauma and it's a place that has magic. And when you go back and read it again, you're like, oh my God, of course. And so that's when the light went off on my head about like Ben Mears as a novelist returning to this town. You know, now he's a famous novelist. He's returning to the town he spent magical boyhood years in. Mark Petrie is a 12-year-old boy who's living in the town, right? Who also embodies another part of King, right? Who is that boy who has this expansive imagination, who's able to beat the vampires because of his imagination, right? And that it's the two of them coming together that really is healing, right? And that's when it really hit me that this chapter was going to be about place because Salem's Lot is, and then he, you know, talking to him, how could I not make it about this town? Because was clearly such an important emotional center for him and a lodestone, you know. Um, so that's, I mean, I'm happy to go on. I could talk about Durham and Salem's Lot forever.
I love how you talked about the emotional center for him too. So, you also write about politics and historical events that have influenced King, and he's well known for being vocal about politics. But you ground your writing about this in his personal experiences as a young man growing up during a time of war, and later, and his identity as a father in a way that I found really illuminating. So, can you read from that section, possibly?
Yeah. So this is from the night shift chapter. So when we were talking about like all of those newspaper articles I was reading, you know, that he wrote when he was 19, 20. Um, Now that I've read his reflections on and during this time, I better appreciate how much these early stories represent the imaginative life of a young man going through a series of major life changes in a very short period of time. Living away from home, leaving his conservative upbringing, discovering the power and pain of political protest, falling in love, having children, gaining fame and fortune, losing a parent, and his idealism. How might the seismic shifts that rocked this stage of his development have affected Night Shift's genesis and evolution? Did they leave their mark on the revisions he chose to make to its stories? Were the drafts changing in real time along with him? These are the questions I want to bring with me as I begin this next chapter of my archival work. But first, I want to ask a question of King himself. What inspired him to write the monster that scared me so badly when I was 12? He begins with a pragmatic response. The only thing I remember about the boogeyman is we needed the money to pay the rent, so I needed a story. He did sell it to Cavalier magazine, which published the story in March 1973. But then he goes deeper. Always being in touch with my fears, and two little ones, Naomi and Joe, I was very worried about crib death. I imagine the story came out of that. If there was a more specific ignition point, I don't remember it. Stories are like dreams. They are clear, then they melt like cotton candy. I appreciate King's honesty. His comments capture something so personal about how our fears grow and change along with us. In 1969, before he was a father, he was a student protesting Vietnam and imagining what his hypothetical child's future might look like. Would he have to die for national pride? 3 years later, when he was drafting The Boogeyman, these existential, politically fueled fears about a grown son had relocated onto the tangible, tiny bodies of two very real babies.
Amazing. So much for
He's,
that.
I
yeah.
love that. I mean, that exchange, and like that was an email he whipped off. Like again, I was like, where does this come from? He's just, he's so poetic.
Mhm.
Yeah.
And I'm also just thinking about the fact that, right, and he comes from now, I mean, this family that he, was so worried about, like any young parent, his family isn't now a family full of writers. And I just want to
Mhm.
point, those of our listeners who are big King fans, I actually am a huge fan of Tabitha.
Oh
Um,
yeah, her books are amazing. Yeah,
oh my God, she's so
Mhm.
good.
she's
And
such a good. Yeah. Yeah, very underread. She should be read more.
She should, yeah, she's terrific. And I read her when I was in high school. And then my Susan Dominus, who writes for the New York Times, wrote this incredible New York Times Magazine story about writing as the King family business. And so
I
reading
remember
your
that
book,
article. Yeah.
I mean, such a terrific piece about, and right, the Kings also, not all of whom have the surname King, have this whole interconnected world.
Yeah.
So much of which is set in Maine, and which also connects to the things that you're writing. So
Yeah.
to see this, to see the person behind this incredible career and body of work is such a treat.
Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you
Yeah.
so much for joining us
Oh, it
and
was a pleasure.
Thank
Thank you.
you. It was wonderful. Thank you so
Yeah.
much.
It was absolutely my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Caroline, thanks so much for joining us today. Listeners, you can find out more by going to carolinebicks.com, which is where Caroline's events are listed. And you can pre order Monsters in the Archives at an independent bookseller near you. Thanks for being with us.